I went to a Dutch-American symposium at New York Society for Ethical Culture on October 6th, 7th, 2019. The symposium was called Humanism Cross-Atlantic, Looking for Common Ground. An associate professor, Maricke van den Doel, made a presentation on humanism in the Italian Renaissance. Her presentation was talking about humanism and artists during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Maricke van den Doel is assistant professor in history of humanism at the University of Humanistics in Utrecht, and she's going to be talking about textual and visual humanism in the Italian Renaissance, the collaboration between artists and humanists in the 15th and 16th centuries, and she has some beautiful art lined up for us too. So I'm really going to appreciate. And I think, Janan, you mentioned art earlier in one of your questions. So I'm really looking forward to the way in which Marieke will be talking about that collaboration or that synergy with art and humanism. So thank you so much.
When I started teaching classes in history of humanism a year ago at the University of Humanistics in Utrecht, the Netherlands, I was in search of good definitions of the term humanism. This turned to be quite a complicated task. But fortunately, I stumbled on a booklet by a certain Tony Davies, formerly professor of English in Birmingham. And this booklet was called Humanism, and it contained a glossary. And in this glossary, I found that Davies, after extensive research, had come to the conclusion that humanism is an undefinable term, possibly obsolete. Of course, I came to know, also due to Davies, that there had been several humanisms. Apart from Renaissance humanism, there was Romantic humanism, modern humanism, secular humanism, anti-humanism, world humanism, post-humanism, transhumanism, and anthropocentrism, which also could be called humanism. And to understand more of modern humanism that formed the guiding principle of my university, I was helped by the so-called Amsterdam Declaration. The Amsterdam Declaration, drawn up in 1952 at the First World Humanist Congress, but revised in 2002, that showed not so much the 10 Commandments, but more the 7 pillars of modern humanism, which I show you here. As a specialist in the relations between Renaissance humanism and art, my eye was drawn immediately to the very sympathetic 6th pillar, so to speak, of fundamental principle, which says humanism values artistic creativity and imagination and recognizes the transforming power of art. Humanism affirms the importance of literature, music, and the visual and performing arts for personal development and fulfilment. I felt I had to accompany this wonderful statement with an image of Rembrandt's painting with Moses breaking the tablet of the 10 Commandments. Christianity, although it had been the cause of so many works of art, had always had an ambiguous relationship with visual representations, following from the 4th commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Modern humanism, though, seems to embrace art, human creativity, and the human imagination. And so did Renaissance humanists. The concept of art as containing a transformative power and related to creativity and the human imagination are rooted in the Italian Renaissance. It can be traced back to the close collaboration between humanists and artists during this period. Within the next 45 minutes or so, I will try to demonstrate how this modern conception of art, as formulated in the Amsterdam Declaration, has taken shape during the Renaissance and how humanists have contributed substantially to it. One might even say that art, as we understand it today, was partially a humanist invention. Partially, of course, it was also an artistic invention. If we hear the word art nowadays, we mostly think of the visual arts, painting, drawing, and sculpture. Of course, also the term the arts is commonly used, meaning the visual arts, the performing arts, literature, and music. Not so in the Renaissance. When someone referred to art, the liberal arts immediately would spring to mind. The 7 liberal arts are those subjects or skills that in classical antiquity were considered essential for a free person to know in order to take an active part in civic life. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the university curriculum consisted of these 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, followed by geometry, arithmetics, music, and astronomy. When obtaining a university degree, one would become a master artium, master of arts, which could be followed by obtaining a degree as a doctor in philosophy, theology, or law. So what's new? As we can see, music was one of the liberal arts, and architecture would be taught in classes of geometry. Literature, theatre, and poetry would be part of rhetoric. What we seem to miss are the visual arts. In pre-modern times, painting was not considered an art, but as a craft, techne, in ancient Greek. Artists delivered religious and funeral decorations, sculpture, portraits of the powerful, illuminated manuscripts, but no art. In the Middle Ages, painters would share their guild with other practical professions, robe makers, pharmacists. Contracts for paintings were centered around size and subject matter and the amount of precious materials used, such as gold ultramarine. In the course of the 15th century, this would gradually shift towards other preoccupations. In what amount would a certain master be involved in making an altarpiece? Would a painting be undersigned? Would pupils contribute to it, or only the master? Surely patrons would become interested in other things but gold and precious materials. Their focus of attention shifted towards interest in authenticity and mastery, invention of new subject matters, the handling of paint. So from the 15th century onwards, the craft of painting, and as such the artist's profession, underwent an incredible development and change. Artists became knowledgeable in geometry, think of linear perspective, and anatomy. They became educated in classical text sources from ancient rhetoric and philosophy, for instance, texts expounding on the function of the mind or on inspiration and imagination. In fact, artists were seeking for a theoretical basis for their work as an art, not a craft. More and more, artists worked together with humanists, the translators of classical texts, the educators of the elite, and scholars in the humanities. Humanists helped artists by developing works of art thematically but also visually based on classical art. Here, artists and humanists also shared a common goal. This brings me to the Italian Renaissance as a movement in general. The Italian Renaissance was a movement full of nervous energy. It defined itself proclaiming to establish a revival of classical antiquity. In the course of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, an increasing amount of activities was undertaken to reach this goal. Humanists rediscovered and translated classical text sources and tried to align the context of these sources with Christian doctrine. Antiquarians studied and collected objects from the past. Artists revived the essence of classical art by integrating text sources with newly acquired knowledge about the visual and material culture of antiquity. As said before, humanists, antiquarians, and artists worked together in obtaining this common goal, in reviving ancient times, in bringing back antiquity after a period that was considered dark or something in between, the Middle Ages. The Italian Renaissance could be considered as a revolutionary movement, revolutionary, but with a thoroughly reactionary scope, bringing back the past. Interestingly, it turned out to be the starting point of abundant creativity and which resulted in radical new outcomes and ideas. It brought forth great masterpieces of art, and many scientific, philosophical, religious, and literary texts from antiquity were rediscovered and translated. These developments did not occur independently of each other. The interaction between humanist discoveries and translations and artists' innovations resulted in the emergence of new genres of themes in painting. The dialogue between humanists and artists yielded another outcome that may have been even more significant. Within the artistic milieu, this interaction inspired a growing interest in philosophical matters and for the first time in art, posed the question, what is art? In return, the blossoming of the arts must have had an impact on the visual orientation of the philosophical ideas of the age. Now it is time to return to the sixth commandment of our Amsterdam Declaration. Humanism values artistic creativity and imagination and recognizes the transforming power of art. To understand how humanists contributed to this conception of the transforming power of art during the Renaissance, I would like to bring in mind those other commandments written on the stone tablets that Moses brought with him from Mount Sinai. Those of you that have a Jewish or Christian background might remember that Moses, in anger, broke these tablets in pieces because he saw the Israelites had violated the fourth commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. They danced around a statue of a golden calf. Apparently, the statue had a certain effect on the Israelites. It made them forget their law, their religion, their God. It had transformed them. In pre- and early modern times, people thoroughly believed in the power of images. Images were considered to have healing, but also magically destructive power. Images were thought to attract and channel divine or astrological forces, or could even be a substitute for God on earth. On this portrait on the left, this is a portrait of Elisabetta Gonzaga by the Renaissance painter Raphael. The lady wears an amulet of her sun sign Scorpio on her head. And on the right, by Piero della Francesca, Christ child wears a talisman made out of coral. That was considered to have apotropaic powers, as it was a symbol of the transubstantiation, the transformation from wine to Christ's blood. Also, the lifelikeness of images was thought to have a transformative power on the viewer. Humanists introduced the concept enargeia in Renaissance art theory. Enargeia was a concept derived from classical rhetoric, meaning the power of an orator to enchant the public by lifelike and convincing descriptions of objects or situations. The enargeia of the orator would make a description so lifelike that the public thought the object, person, or situation described was actually present before them. A painting can also be lifelike and convincing and making things present. So enargeia became a concept visualized in Renaissance painting. And I will give an example. So here on the right, we see a portrait of a young man. He is dressed as a soldier, a halberdier. It is not unthinkable the portrait was made for his lover or his wife as a memory when going into war. The painting on the left side is a cover plate for the portrait. So that portrait was held in a box, and that was the cover of the box. The image on the cover plate invites us to open the box with the portrait inside and to contemplate its quality and meaning. The cover plate encourages us to act and changes our perception of that work of art. So on that cover side, we see on the left a young man kneeling, and an almost naked woman gazes at us and is standing on a pedestal. In the middle is an altar depicted with an oxen on it sacrificed. Flames on the altar are glowing up. This painting shows us the story of Pygmalion, a prince and sculptor from ancient Cyprus. He withdrew himself from the world and from love. One day, locked up in his palace, he made a statue that he thought was so incredibly beautiful that he prayed to Venus to make the statue alive. When sacrificing an oxen to Venus, the fire on the altar flamed up and his prayers were heard. At the very instant the statue came to life, this happened. The statue transformed in a real woman of flesh and blood, and she became Pygmalion's lover, Galatea. As a viewer of the scene depicted, we are present at the very moment the statue is transformed into a living person. Galatea is no longer as white as ivory, the material out of which she was made. Her color shows us she is alive. Behind her, the fire is flaming up. It is as if this transformation is happening just in front of our eyes. We are present at the moment supreme. This makes us contemplate the lifelikeness of the painting. Moreover, the painting invites us to open the box and admire the lifelikeness of the portrait hidden inside. The painting itself has agency. It sets us in motion and changes our perception of the scene depicted. Here we see energia at work, the transformative power of art. The next image shows us a portrait of Bianca Capello, the mistress and later wife of Francesco de' Medici, son of Archduke of Tuscany. Bianca was a prized beauty in her time. This portrait, that purportedly was a gift from Francesco to Bianca, does not have a painted cover, but a painted reverse side. On the reverse side, we see a complicated allegory that invites us again to contemplate the ways we should consider and understand the portrait, or maybe how Bianca should see the intention of the gift made to her. As we shall see, it has a very poetic and romantic meaning. The allegory on the reverse side is copied from a drawing made by Michelangelo. The drawing commonly is called The Dream, or in Italian, Il Sogno. When studying this drawing, we will understand that Renaissance concepts of imagination and inspiration are visualized here, and that these concepts were considered of importance to the work and ideas of artists. At least the maker of this drawing, Michelangelo Buonarroti, considered them of importance to his own work and his personality. To explain the meaning of the drawing, I first will have to make an excursion to the ideas of the Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino, humanist at the court of the Medici family in Florence. Ficino led a fairly tranquil life as a brilliant scholar, maintaining an extensive network of fellow humanists, pupils and patrons. He was young when he began translating Plato's dialogues. Cosimo de' Medici commissioned him to translate these, as well as the text fragments from late antiquity known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Later in his career, he translated and wrote commentaries on the work of Plotinus and other classical Neoplatonists, such as Synesius, Iamblichus, and Proclus. He drew from this Neoplatonist body of thought for his own writing, and some of his works, including De Amore from 1469, a commentary on Plato's Symposium, and De Vita Libritres, were widely read for a long time. In these works, as well as the 18-volume Platonic Theology, he laid out his ideas on the power of the imagination, human creativity, and divine inspiration. Beauty and the ascension of the human soul it inspires, a notion borrowed from the Platonic tradition, are recurrent themes in his work. In addition, the power of sight and the imagination are highly valued in Ficino's oeuvre, and although often denied, his philosophy is visually oriented. Art historians have searched the possible relationship between the ideas of Ficino and the art of the Italian Renaissance. And I will try to contribute to this to show the influence of Ficino's thought and that of his pupil Diaceto on Michelangelo's drawing The Dream. Neoplatonic concepts in the work of Michelangelo can be explained because already at an early age, Michelangelo could have become acquainted with Platonist thought when he became part of Lorenzo il Magnifico's household. And here you see Lorenzo and young Michelangelo, who is making a statue, and he's in fact discovered by Lorenzo as a young genius. Here the writings of Ficino circulated, and young Michelangelo could have met the old man Ficino. Michelangelo's interest in Platonic love is furthermore shown in his authorized biography by Ascanio Condivi, where nuances are made to gossip about Michelangelo's homosexuality. Condivi says that Michelangelo talked much about love, but not otherwise than described in the works of Plato, to which he adds hastily that he has not got a clue what Plato says about that subject. After 1516, Michelangelo's Platonism may have intensified when he became a member of the Accademia Sacra dei Medici in Rome. He will have met Giovanni Corsi here, who became a biographer of Ficino, and Francesco Catani da Diaceto, Ficino's most favorite pupil. And here, the upper sentence you see, Ego Franciscus Cataneus Diacetus, so that's a sort of list of members. And here you see Eoel, Michelangelo's author. It's very difficult to read, but and he writes in Italian while the others write in Latin. Arguably, it was through the contact with the Aceto and his work Panegirico all'amore, published in Rome in 1526, and an adaptation of Ficino's De Amore, that Platonic thought effused into Michelangelo's artistic convictions, as are expressed in Pacific's poems and drawings. The Aceto's I Tre Libri d'Amore could have played an important role in this. The Aceto's work can be regarded as an early modern version of Platonic love for dummies. In a few short chapters, he gives an outline of Ficinian ideas, theories on love, beauty, and inspiration. This very concoction of Platonic love and inspiration are important for both the artistic statements made in the dream and for its function as a refined love present. I will later come back to that. Ficino worked extensively on the topic of imagination in the book, 13th book of Platonic Theology, where he tried to demonstrate the divinity of the soul by showing the power the imagination has as a faculty of the soul over the body. According to Ficino, by mere imagination we can start blushing, faint, cause nausea or sexual desire. But we cannot only influence our own body, also the mother, for instance, influenced the child before it was born. In this time, people thought that thinking too much of an Ethiopian, your child might become black. And actually looking at beautiful paintings or sculptures may lead to pretty children. A strong imagination can make other people ill, make them fall in love. It can be the medium by means one could cause natural disasters and receive future-telling dreams. According to a tradition derived from Aristotle, the imagination or phantasy is a faculty of knowledge intermediary between the senses and the intellect. So in the front of the head is the imagination, and it is a sort of intermediary between what you see outside and how things are transformed inside your head. It forms a bridge between sense perception and intellect, because the soul does not think without images or so-called phantasmata. The fantasy transforms the sense perception perceived by the body into phantasmata by means of which they can be visualized in a mind, be thought or remembered. I give a lot of theory for a small moment, but then I will apply it to the painting. Sensory impressions are led from the senses to the soul by means of the spirit or pneuma, a semi-material vapor substance consisting of the same matter of which the stars are made. The spirit is also the instrument by which phantasmata are led through the soul and by which the soul communicates with the body and causes it to perform all vital activities. Plato, in the Phaedrus, so that's the source for Ficino, postulates that the imagination, since it's connected to the sense impressions perceived by the body, can drag down the soul to the material world or prevent it from flying back to its divine origin. At the other hand, by means of sensing or imagining earthly beauty, the soul might remember the heavenly beauty of the ideas and may find itself in a state of furor, by which it can fly back to its heavenly homeland. Last element, in Timaeus, Plato states that by means of frenzy, man can be divinely inspired. Nevertheless, it will always be God who creates phantasmata within the human soul, and man may not always understand the images he perceives in this inspirational state of mind. Our humanist Ficino echoes this notion in the Platonic theology by postulating that men of great prudence, here's another version of it, men of great prudence, and those most learned from their youth have not turned out to be the best poets. Rather, some of the poets were mad, as was said of Homer and Lucretius. Poets in a frenzy sing of many things, and marvelous ones at that, which a little later, when their frenzy has abated, they do not sufficiently understand. It was as if they themselves had not pronounced the word, but God had spoken loudly through them, through trumpets. And please remember these trumpets. Also in Vita Libri Tres, which deals with the melancholic temperament, Ficino elaborates on the theme of inspiration and imagination. Ficino considers himself a melancholiac, melancholiacs which usually suffer from such uneasiness as gluttony, avarice, anger, a strong sexual desire, and a bad health. On the contrary, The melancholy temperament is the only humor providing a disposition for genius, a notion derived from Aristotle. And because of this, it is the temperament for scholars and artists. This geniality is caused by his subtle and inflammable spirit, combustible like a kind of brandy, which makes him ecstatic and inclined to frenzy in an extreme way. And this frenzy makes his soul fly up to heaven, makes his imagination receptive for inspiration, but it leaves him burned out and depressed after his ecstasy. Ficino's opinions on melancholy, frenzy, and inspiration were appropriated or used by Michelangelo in his presentation drawings. Most of these drawings were made for Tommaso de Cavalieri, his supposed lover, around 1533, just after his meeting with the young boy. I will now focus on the drawing entitled The Dream. Michelangelo presented himself to Tommaso definitely as a melancholy man. You see the portrait of Michelangelo made by Raphael as a very melancholy person. In his letters and poetry dedicated to him, Michelangelo complains about his own temperament, his dark sides and depressions. He will compare himself with the moon. Tommaso is the sun. Michelangelo was not alone in making this comparison. So Raphael, for instance, portrayed him in the school of Athens as a melancholiac. And in Giampaolo Lomazzo's treatise Idea del Tempio della Pittura, Michelangelo represents the contemplative side of Saturn. And painter and friend Francesco d'Orlando, moreover, tells us that Michelangelo may be socially awkward, but this is not out of pride, but because he does not want to get corrupted by useless conversations of good-for-nothings and his intellect drawn from the continuous elevated imaginations that always embellish his mind. So he's a very melancholic, inspired person. As we shall see, Michelangelo's drawing of the dream is but another statement of his melancholic yet inspirational qualities. Art historian Aaron Panofsky explained the iconography of the drawing as the human soul surrounded by the 7 cardinal virtues and vices. But if we take a closer look, I hope I have a detail of it. If we take a closer look, we don't see any virtues at all, neither all of the 7 cardinal sins. We encounter, I hope you can see it, we encounter gluttony. Can you see that? So people eating and drinking. We encounter sexual desire, avarice, and anger, and maybe even sloth. So 6 of the cardinal sins. But we seem to miss, for instance, the sin of pride. The vices depicted seem to refer not to the cardinal sins, but to the bad habits belonging to the melancholiac, and reflect the opinions of Ficino on the melancholic temperament. This drawing shows us the melancholiac surrounded by the vices of his temperaments, gluttony, desire, anger, and avarice, and also the depressed sides of the melancholiac are demonstrated. Also, to the melancholic's inclination for geometry, as he thought to have, is depicted by means of the globe. Here you see that same kind of element. Other melancholic figures depicted. So you see also these globes. This is a picture of the gein, and also a bag of money showing the avarice of the melancholiac. So the iconography of the Sogno drawing, the dream drawing, therefore seems to represent the soul, not the soul surrounded by the virtues and vices, as Panofsky suggested, but visualizes the qualities belonging to the melancholic temperament, both the negative and the positive sides of it, as is shown by the human figure depicted, which is being inspired through his imagination. In a very literal way, we see the spirit flying in from above and blown into the forehead of the melancholic through a trumpet. This reminds us of Ficino's citation from his Platonic theology on words loudly spoken as through trumpets. Also, Ficino's theories on fantasy and imagination are brought into remembrance, since the place where the melancholiac of the drawing is being inspired is in his forehead, where traditionally the faculty of imagination is to be located. We also see this in a print. Here you see it also, but you see it also in a print of Robert Flood. As you have understood, the melancholic temperament, as described by humanist Ficino, has become a model for the artist's temperament, vexed by a problematic character, but with a refined imagination and a strong disposition for inspiration. Ficino has created the theoretical background for this, and Michelangelo appropriated these ideas in works of art. Here, our modern conception of art is born, for which we consider inspiration and the human imagination of great importance. Ficino's pupil Diaceto elaborates on the theme of melancholy too, which seemed to be the subject of this drawing. And according to Diaceto, melancholy occurs when the soul cannot return to its divine origins. Also, love is one great source for melancholy, of course. Love, in Diaceto's view, is neither divine nor mortal. Love is neither divine nor mortal, but a great demon, whilst the demonic nature is, to a certain extent, placed between man and God as an intermediary, and it leads man's prayers and offerings to the gods, and in reverse order, the will and commandments of the gods to man. And by no other means than by demonic nature, man is awake or in dreams inspired by divine goodness. This remark originates in Ficino's De Amore, where love is said to be the midway between heavenly and earthly things. The winged messenger in the drawing is the spirit, the subtle substance that permeates everything, that visualizes love, the great demon, which functions as an intermediary between God and human beings, inspires the human soul when it is awake or asleep. There is no better way to show what contemplation of love and beauty can lead to than by means of Michelangelo's visual masterpiece. I'm coming to an end now. As I already mentioned, the Sogno drawing was a love gift for Michelangelo's lover, Tommaso de Cavalieri. The same holds good for the portrait of Bianca Capello, with the dream copied on the reverse side by Michelangelo's colleague Alessandro Allori. The deeper meaning of this love gift from Francesco to Bianca is the inspiration that love and beauty can give. I hope to have shown what was really on Michelangelo's mind when he drew the dream. Furthermore, I hope to have demonstrated that the cross-pollination and collaboration between humanists and artists in the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, the period of the Renaissance, has formed our modern conception of art. In this period, artists and humanists pursued similar goals in different ways. We may conclude that Renaissance humanism was not limited to textually transferable views and rational knowledge alone, but was embedded in a visual and material culture. In the Amsterdam Declaration of International Humanists, we find this modern conception of art back that emerged from the symbiosis between artists and humanists. Its transformative power and its effect on and relation to the human imagination and creativity are its most vital and central principles. I bring to mind humanism values artistic creativity and imagination and recognizes the transforming power of art. Humanism affirms the importance of literature, music, and the visual and performing arts for personal development and fulfillment. From Renaissance humanism, these ideas emerged. For modern humanists, these views, concepts, and insights could form a point of departure for creativity and new inspiration. Thank you.
So you're focusing on a particular time. I'm wondering if your work covers other periods as well, and if so, what do you're applying these different humanist values to different periods of art. Does that apply in other periods as well as the Renaissance, or is this when you see it particularly in flower?
Well, in my research, I focus especially on Renaissance humanism and art, but I hope to have shown that here a modern conception of art was born, in fact, and so it applies on the idea of art in the whole period thereafter. So also our modern ideas of art is something that can transform you, or art is something that alludes to your imagination, and that is or if you make art yourself, you can also be transformed by it, and that is because of that your creativity is set in motion. These ideas are in fact rooted in the Renaissance, and especially in this collaboration between artists and humanists. So I was actually, for this talk, searching for, so what can Renaissance humanism learn us from understanding modern humanism? So in what ways it can be an inspiration? And of course there can be several angles or points of view, but yeah, my angle is of course art. So I thought, well, these ideas that we have in humanism, also on art, where do they come from? So they come from Renaissance humanism.
I was wondering, you're saying, you were speaking of modern conceptions of art originating here in Renaissance. Is that really true? I mean, the Renaissance concept of art is quite different from romantic conceptions of art, aren't they? So what do you mean by modern conceptions of art?
No, I do think, in fact, that this romantic idea of art is rooted in the Renaissance. So this whole idea of geniality, artisticity, mastery of one person, and also this disposition of the artist that is problematic, but the artist is a genius. We think that that is a 19th century conception of art, and that it is our modern idea of how art works. But I think this theory of Ficino, and also the way Michelangelo adopted it, shows us that it is a Renaissance idea of art. So I think we have a misconception about that. This idea of art is already much older, but the Romantics, they really loved that idea, and especially these works of art like Michelangelo's. So they sort of made these ideas greater, and they were exaggerating it more, and were really trying to be more genial and trying to be more difficult as artists. But in fact, it is a Renaissance idea. So it really goes together with this, this stress on the individual, and also on human capacity that was also developed in this period. So I don't think it's a 19th century idea at all. It was blown up in the 19th century, but it's going back much longer. And of course also a lot of these ideas that Ficino uses, they come from antiquity, but they were never applied on the visual arts. They were applied on rhetorics. But he for the first time is thinking of the visual arts, and also artists are interested in his ideas. Well, I'd like to hear.
Well, thank you for your presentation. My own, what I observe in art and what I've been told and learned too is there's so much that was of Christ and of everything Christianity. Over 90% of things I saw in Europe and the museums here and whatever, and even in one of our classical New York City music stations on the radio, they were just talking about a composer who turned out such a piece of music that was so torturous because he himself felt so constricted about what he can do as a composer with his creativity, constricted by the religious movements. So I guess are you trying to say that once they were free of that, they could start to be more creative and show what they really showed? Because for me, that takes away a lot of looking at art when I'm seeing 95% of everything is Christianity. And it just hurts me to feel how constricted they must have felt. So is that kind of what you're bringing out in this? Or?
Well, not exactly. I think also Catholicism has been a great patron for the arts, and also a lot of artists have worked for that and have found ways in which they could express themselves. But absolutely something changes during the Renaissance. So even within, also by Catholic patrons, so just think of the Sistine Chapel, for instance. These are probably Christian subject matters, but here Michelangelo works on it, and he applies all kind of classical and antique ideas. So the naked body of the people shown, and also showing Christ as a sort of Apollo instead of a bearded figure that suffers, but is more a triumphant kind of Apollo figure. Here you see that ideas of what you can do with art change. And, well, it's unfortunately that I don't have some pictures of it, but till the end of the Middle Ages, indeed, most art, apart from a few portraits and funeral statues, is Christian. And then at the beginning of the Renaissance, you see to emerge classical themes in art. So that's a really new, different point of view. So it started with small boxes with Venus on it. So these boxes given to brides, or a small marriage chest with Paris on it or something, or also Venus again. And then within a period of 20, 30 years, we see for the first time pictures that have the size of altarpieces, but that show Venus in enormous size on it. So, for instance, Primavera of Botticelli, that is a painting that has the size of an altarpiece for the first time, but not with a Christian theme on it. And after that, I just showed it for a moment. Well, this is in a palace, and this is showing the battle between the giants and the titans, and this is really enormous. So these giants are depicted 3 meters high, for instance. So you see also a material presence of other themes emerging in this time. So it's not only Marys with babies or dead Christs, but you see these enormous palaces that are decorated with themes from, especially antique themes, and well, showing pagan gods, while at the same time the culture is Christian. So there is a tension, and that flourishes for well, I'd say hundreds of years. And by the Reformation, these things change, because then the Catholic Church is put under pressure, and also, for instance, bishops or cardinals that collect this kind of art, of have their palaces decorated by these antique themes, they are actually corrected and said, you can do that no longer, so we don't want to see that anymore. There become strict rules for the Catholic Church and art. But that doesn't mean that something has changed. So there were new patrons that were interested in other themes, or wanted to portrait themselves, and artists that said, I have made this, see how I've made it. So they're not longer in service of the church, but they are really creating something themselves. So I think this is really a moment in time where things change, and especially Renaissance art is something to enjoy if you get depressed by seeing so much religious art, because it's extremely pagan, in fact. So it's maybe also gods, but completely different type of art, in fact.
The question that Anne took up with you about different periods. I mean, the advantage of studying the Renaissance, apart from the fact that it is your specialty, is that you can link up a humanist text with various works of art. But actually, it seemed to me that if you'd stayed closer to home, you could have actually explored some humanist themes in works of art that make, as it were, the humanist transformation independently of written down text. So let's take...
Can you speak a little bit more up, because I do not...
Dutch art in the 17th century, and think of Vermeer and Ter Houtsch and the ways in which they give status to the ordinary. They express this idea that that in the everyday you can find value. I'm thinking of that wonderful picture of the milkmaid, and some of the Ter Houtsch interiors too. But even earlier, and this I think is even more interesting. If you go back to Bruegel, you not only have the focus on the ordinary individual, you've also got to focus on the community. So, I mean, in the works about the wedding picture and the picture of the peasants dancing and so forth, you have a sense of living fulfillment in the everyday, not by the individual in isolation, but by the individual in social connection with others, the kinds of things that your group is so focused on in humanist themes. And A final Bruegelian example, the fall of Icarus, right? So, fall of Icarus, Bruegel's Fall of Icarus, where the boy is going into the sea in the background, and in the foreground you've got all sorts of interesting everyday things happening. That inspired...
The Fall of Icarus, now I understand it, sorry.
La chute d'Icare. That inspired Auden several centuries later to write a very philosophical poem about the importance of the ordinary. So I actually think that humanism in your own native land or in its vicinity is there in a somewhat stronger and more powerful form. So may I make a heretical suggestion? Don't go to the Renaissance, don't go to these theorizers, go to the people who really turn to the human in the visual autonomously. Why not?
Yes, well, I can say something about that. I'm also a bit exceptional in the Netherlands because all art historians are working on Dutch art. And actually, I'm the exception that is working on Renaissance art, and I do think that this all starts in a Renaissance. Also, the developments in Dutch art in the 17th century start here. And may I explain myself? Because in the Renaissance, this change is made of other themes and other possibilities to depict. So that is first change that is made. And then we get the second change that by Renaissance humanism, we get this interest in studying not only classical texts, but also the Bible. And that gives an incentive to the Reformation. And because of the Reformation, the Catholic Church is no longer a very important patron anymore, especially not in the Netherlands, which becomes a Protestant country. So there is no work for painters anymore to work for the Catholic Church. So what happens in the Dutch 17th century is that all these new genres emerge. So we get portraits that become very important, but also daily life, like the Milkmaid from Vermeer or the paintings of Rembrandt. And very often these paintings still not only depict the daily life or ordinary people, because very often they also have hidden meanings behind them, like Renaissance painting, but a little bit more hidden, in fact. So I would not say, well, the Renaissance is not interesting and Dutch art is. Something changes in the Renaissance, and from there develops all kind of other things that also happen in the Dutch Republic, and also after that, things radically change connected to art. So that's why we also have so much stress as art historians on this Renaissance, because so much developments come from that. So I think that what happens in the Dutch Republic is really completely connected to what I have told just here.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? When exactly does Bruegel come in this development? And I mean, it seems so, his celebrations of the everyday village seems so far from the kind of the world that you are, your pictures show.
So he's working in the 16th century in Flanders, and of course these developments that I have described first start in Italy, and Dutch art is not on a very far level at that time from a visual point of view. So Bruegel is a pioneer in a certain sense. And then after that, a lot of artists from the Netherlands start to travel to Italy, and they see not only classical art, but they see also Renaissance art. So they are transformed by that, and they start to develop their own styles and their own genres. And so, yeah, I would not think of dividing these works of art. Art particularly is a very international thing, and also artists influence them in a very international way. So first this is divided for some time, the North and the South, but after Renaissance, in fact, that changes, and Dutch artists go to Italy and bring these ideas home and make their own from that, what they encounter there. I hope that answers your question.
I like the idea actually that you can do it without high theory, that you can do it without high theory. You don't need Ficino and the likes of Ficino before you can come to be, as you said of Bruegel, a pioneer.
Yes, absolutely, but I don't see a contradiction between it.
Marieke, thank you so much for your exciting talk. And art always strikes me as something that's often missing from the conversations that we often have around humanism. And I guess I'm thinking of two things. One, can you talk a little bit about, perhaps maybe for you, the manner in which your examination of art has challenged and or sort of helped to develop further your ideas of humanism? Mm-hmm. I asked that question because when I started working on religion and hip-hop some years ago, for me it wasn't just about looking for religion in hip-hop, but it was also about using hip-hop as a way, so what happens to religion when we transpose hip-hop onto it, and then what happens to hip-hop when we start to use the category of religion as a way forward. And then I guess that leads me to the second question, which is, can you say a little bit about your method? What methods have you taken up in your hermeneutical sort of journey looking at humanisms in art?
At first, of course, as a student, I was extremely attracted by Renaissance art, and that made me interested in the changes that you see in this time. So as I described, we see first only religious art, and then we see at once all kind of altarpieces with pagan images on it. So I was attracted by that. And I read a lot of texts as an art history student first that told me that all kind of philosophical ideas were behind it. So when I was able to start a PhD, I wanted to explore that subject. And then there was this interesting moment in which, when starting a PhD with research on Ficino and his influence on art, I was attacked by all kind of art historians in a very extreme way. So they were actually saying that my work would not result in anything and that it would be a horrible subject and I shouldn't do it. I was really disencouraged extremely, and what happened to be the case, I found out that in the 50s and 60s this had been a very very fashionable topic, and it was deconstructed in the period of the 90s by all kind of art historians. So they thought that there were no ideas behind it, and that Renaissance art actually was nothing more than wallpaper showing the adorning all kind of palaces, and that was so my idea was a very old idea that I was working on. So then after that I decided to focus on all the debates. So there were a lot of debates on Ficino's influence on art, and I tried to see what has this art historian said, what has this art historian said. So then there were all kind of open questions. And so this is where my method starts, so just by comparing all kind of texts on it. And then also, of course, I had to read Ficino, read the text very precisely. And then I got all kind of ideas that these deconstructions made in the 90s were actually not really done very well, not very thorough, and that when diving into other kind of documents, so I went into archives, for instance, and at a certain point I really felt like a sort of detective for going searching for documents. So like, for instance, I found that document that showed that Michelangelo actually was in a group with certain humanists, so that they knew them and that he could have read their books, and because often people said that he couldn't read Latin, so how did he get to his ideas? So there was a sort of detective work of all kind of documents putting together, and then after a certain time I just chose a few famous subject matter, so Michelangelo and Botticelli, to show that this deconstruction of the influence of Ficino's ideas on Renaissance art was actually something that should be revised. So that was the idea of my thesis, and also of the work. Yeah, that's how I worked through it. So that brought me on the path of humanism, in fact. So now I'm sort of zooming out.
Studying the history of humanism, I read a book by Charles Nauert on Renaissance humanism, and he's trying to figure out what exactly is humanism in the Renaissance. And he comes to the conclusion that some of the most distinguishing characteristics of humanism are a sense of history, which of course made it possible to see that the Greeks and the Romans were really living in a different type of society and culture than people at the end of the Middle Ages and etc. Now it goes on reconstructing, revising humanism, and in the end he concludes that people like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola were not humanists at all. Ficino was a Neoplatonist, and Pico della Mirandola was a kind of scholastic Aristotelian, and the humanists were exactly a different type of people who were attacking the scholastic debates Pico della Mirandola was taking part in, and they were attacking the kind of systematic philosophy Ficino was trying to present. And in the end, he says Ficino and Pico della Mirandola are not humanists at all. And I realize this is a very different debate from the one you were involved in, but I just wanted to bring it forward and ask your response.
Yes, it is. I'm aware of Charles Nauert saying that, and that's also something I came across, that it depends also a bit on what is your definition of Renaissance humanism. And a person like Nauert, he is saying that, in fact, only translators of Greek and Latin texts that are humanists, and people working on the court are also no humanists, but people only educating the burghers, the elite in the city-states, that are humanists. So he has this very narrow idea of humanism that is also how do you say that? This is also linked to the opinions of modern-day classicists. So the people really knowing every detail on a Greek or a Latin text and understanding this Greek and Latin to a very detailed extent, that is a humanist. So that was one of the ways in which it was attacked, that people were saying, well, Ficino is not a humanist because his Latin was not as good as that of Cicero, for instance. These kind of ideas were also brought up. So if you apply a little bit broader idea of what Renaissance humanism is, well, maybe Ficino is not a humanist, but he's indeed a very important translator of Plato, so that makes him a humanist, and his translations are used till the 19th century. Then for the first time new translations are made. But he's also a philosopher, and he develops new ideas on the basis of this whole Platonic tradition. The idea that humanists were against scholasticism is also a bit an old-fashioned idea by Nauert, I think, because most of the humanists were educated in scholasticism and were combining that with their new ideas, the methods that they learned, they used that and applied them all the time. So I think his ideas a bit of Renaissance humanism is a very strict kind of idea, and also a bit something to revise, probably. So like court humanists, why should they be excluded, for instance? And people developing their own ideas on the basis of the classical traditions, are they immediately no humanists, for instance? So I think, Nauert, it's of course, his book is already, I think, from the 70s or so. A lot of people have contributed to new ideas on Renaissance humanism, and maybe we should not use his definition anymore. That's what I think.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. Well, why don't we take a break then? And thank you so very much. Thank you.